So we're live with Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs, who is the author of Erased: What American Patriarchy Has Hidden from Us. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm such a big fan of yours, so it's exciting.
Well, likewise, and I want to dig right in because there's so much I could talk to you about. I feel like so much of my interest overlaps with your scholarship. So let's start with the very purposeful inclusion of the word American in
Yeah,
American patriarchy. And now I have heard you say that you need to contextualize patriarchy to defeat it.
yeah,
So I would love to have you explain what you mean by that, and then also give us a little primer on American patriarchy specifically.
amazing. Yes. So, American patriarchy, I first always have to say, I'm not saying that the US is the only place where patriarchy exists when I say American patriarchy by any means. It exists across the world. I've seen it in so many of the places that I've lived myself. But what I am saying is that it operates differently in each of the places where we see it. And so, in order for us to really dismantle it, eventually, we do need to be very specific about thinking about how the leaders of each of these different places and the kind of founders of each of these different places chose patriarchy and how they used it in their context. So in the United States, I often talk about the founding fathers and how they are saying in the United States with the Constitution that men get to own land, men get to vote. Women do not get to do these things, but they're creating a binary that doesn't include most people. So it's not only about men are ruling over women, it's also that we're creating a gender binary where we're excluding anybody who's non binary. We're also excluding people who at the time were enslaved. So they're not including Black people. They're excluding Indigenous people. They're excluding poor people because many of the founding fathers wanted it to be the case that only people who owned land could vote in the United States. So all of this is important in our understanding of who gets to be man or woman in the US. So that's what I mean when I say American patriarchy. And I'm also very purposely using this notion that we have of like American, we're like the only America kind of situation, because I'm very aware that the Americas include so much else. But also for us to pay some attention to how we use the word in so much of our writing and so much of our scholarship. And so I'm kind of flipping all of that on its head and saying, okay, this is how we've defined what it means to be American. And this is how flawed the system is. So that's where my definition is coming from.
And in your book, you're really drawing the through line from this founding of this system of deciding who's fully human and who's fully entitled to rights and their full humanity. But you're drawing it from the founding through to now. And a lot of times when I talk about patriarchy in the context of the United States, so American patriarchy, there is a lot of denial or an illusion that, oh, well, obviously these barriers that you're talking about, the explicit exclusion of women, of people of color, of indigenous folks from having voting rights or the access to be able to own land if they want to. Well, that's gone. And so, what are you talking about? And
Right.
can you kind of, I know this is like the whole thrust of the book, so I don't, I'm not expecting you to summarize it in a couple minutes here, but can you just talk a little bit about, you know, how that illusion is upheld, that these systems are still not, or I guess like this idea that these systems are still not operating as they were founded. How is there so much denial of that and mainstream buy-in to that denial?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's part of the reason that this patriarchy in the United States has been upheld, because of this narrative that we've made so much progress. This is no longer the issue. We're no longer even dealing with patriarchy. We're no longer even dealing with racism, right? All of this kind of contemporary conversation about post racism. We know none of that is the case. And the way I like to tell people about it is, okay, let's all for a second try to not point fingers at each other right now. Just for a moment, let's all return to the system that was founded and what they were doing when they wrote the Constitution about 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, and how every law, every institution, everything that organizes our nation comes from this vision of who gets to be considered human in the United States. I also make sure to tell people that the United States is relatively young when we're looking at other nations. 250 years is not a lot of time by any means. And so we can't talk about any of this history as if it's ancient history.
Mm,
It's actually very recent history. And so that's why we so clearly still see traces of that vision, that original social order is what I call it, in everything that we're witnessing today. The other part of it is that progress in the United States has never happened in this linear fashion. So it's never been, people really like to speak about it this way, but this is where we get very confused. It's never been, oh, okay, now women get the right to vote, and now it's guaranteed forever that women are going to get the right to vote. And then we got better, and then Black people had the right to vote. It's
right.
actually always been a tug of war. So the way I summarize American history is often by saying that we have one group of people who really wanted to protect the original social order, the notion that the only people who should be recognized fully in the United States are white men with property. So elite white men is how they saw themselves. And that everybody else should be submissive to this group of people, that the women in their lives should solely reproduce their power through children, and everybody else is not human, but can have some of the benefits of American patriarchy if they assimilate closely enough and if they're willing to protect the social order. So that's one group, wants to protect that original social order. Then we see that those who are excluded from this say this is not good enough. And we can fight for more, and we can actually move closer to an actual democracy. So they've been fighting to say we all need to be included in this notion of who gets to be human in the United States and who gets to be protected by the Constitution in the United States. And so that's how we can see this constant actual tug of war in American history, where we move closer to this vision on this side, and then there's this response to pull it back. And then we say, nope, we're going to keep pulling, we're going to keep moving in the right direction, and you're going to constantly see this pull back. But what we're starting to see now is more people are seeing that they were not themselves included in this definition of human.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they were also being hurt by it. So nobody is left unscathed by this hierarchy or this notion that in order to be human, you have to dominate other people. In order to have power, you have to silence others. You're also hurt by that in the process. So that's why, really, I would say we're winning on this side. It's the reason why there's been such a response of anger and vitriol. It's the reason why when we speak very proudly about we're not being tricked by this any longer, we know that there's other ways of living, we know that we could eventually access a real democracy if we're all included in it, that you're going to see those who are holding on desperately to that original social order responding so aggressively. It's what we're witnessing right now. It's this continuation of the tug of war. But I personally believe this side is getting incredibly strong.
Mm. Now, one of the things you talk about is how these systems that work to control us are really very arbitrary. They are not preordained, they are not inevitable, they are not natural. And I write about this a lot, but there is this tension between the fact that it is so arbitrary and it is so fragile that it constantly needs to be reinforced and remade.
Yeah.
And yet, it is so stubborn. And it still so effectively reproduces inequality along the same racial lines, gender lines, class lines. And I'm curious to hear your take on that kind of tension.
Yeah, that's exactly why actually it's so rigid, is because it's so fragile. It's entirely made up, you know? So if we're looking specifically at, these moments where I'm saying we have to see the leaders who chose it and why they chose it. We look at the founding fathers, we see that they won the Revolutionary War, and they're the underdogs. Nobody was expecting this to happen. They weren't fully expecting that they were going to win either. And then those 10 years after the Revolutionary War, they are very concerned because the revolutionary spirit is spreading across this new
Mm,
nation where You're seeing rebellions, you're seeing slave revolts, you're seeing Shays Rebellion, for example, where poor farmers are asking to be treated more fairly in their nation. It's that rebellion and several others that lead them to say, we need to write the Constitution because we didn't respond fast enough in terms of being able to put an end to that rebellion. They become very concerned that they are going to lose power in the nation that they fought to win. And so all of it actually comes from a lot of fear and insecurity and a need to control the people that they did not see as people. That is the inspiration for the Constitutional Convention. You even have some founding fathers who say, we won't attend because they also believed that those that were leading this convention were too fearful and were acting in fear in terms of controlling those rebellions. So even Thomas Jefferson, for example, said, we cannot act this way. We should be okay with some rebellious spirit amongst the people. But the majority of them said, we need to control who is going to have access here. So that's not Anna's controversial opinion. Documented, this is written. And so in order to establish something that isn't natural, that isn't the social order, to make people act a certain way where you need to control them, you have to make it for them the seemingly only option to follow. And the way you do that is one, by erasing the possibilities of other ways of living, right? This is where so much erasure of indigenous cultures becomes very important for the founding fathers. You also make punishment a constant threat to those who can see that we can actually live differently. And then you give enough power to a few people, so some exceptions, to say, hey, if you play your part, then you will also benefit from this made up ladder, this made up hierarchy. But one of the things they didn't really fully think about is that those who they were completely excluding were able then to see very clearly that it was all made up. And so an
Mm,
example of that is Black women during times of slavery being told, you are not a human and your children are not human beings. Your children, in fact, are somebody else's property and we can remove them from you whenever we want to. This is what the law states. So it's not that Black women look at that law and say, oh, must be true because the law says it. No, instead, it's this immediate awareness of how made up it is
mhm,
and how wrong it is. And so that's where the power of not being considered in this made up world comes, because then you say, I can always see beyond what they are offering me. And in fact, I have no other choice but to help build a nation and a world where I am seen, and even more importantly, where my children are seen in their full humanity. And that's where we see these incredible moments of progress, because people said, hey, this is made up. And I understand that you're going to try to punish me. But at this point, you've excluded me so severely that I will confront this and I will confront these consequences and I will expose them for what they are. And so that's kind of the mindset that we start to have, which is, this is made up. It is not divine. It is not the natural order. In fact, we have seen them use religion to justify it, to say,
mhm,
actually, this is God, Father God, and the Son. We're going to talk
mhm,
all about the powerful men that, we're going to erase the women that contributed to any religious documents. The strategy becomes very clear. And what is underneath all of that is severe insecurity and fear.
mm. As you're speaking, everything you say, I just think of a modern example, right? Like, I think of the rollback of Roe v. Wade. I think about how some privileged white women get elevated into positions of power, but it's so conditional upon their willingness to uphold patriarchal power. And then what happens to them, like with Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem,
Tired.
right? It's just it's everywhere, and this is one of the things I struggle with when I wind up talking about American patriarchy is it's so everywhere that when somebody says, "But what are you even talking about?" I can't even begin to like,
It's everywhere.
where
It's
do I be where do I begin? But we begin with your book. But actually, I want to go back to your other book, Three Mothers, because I think a lot of I've heard you say that your inspiration for writing Erased
Yes.
came out of reporting you did on Three Mothers. So can you just tell us a little bit about that book and why it inspired Erased?
Yes, always one of my favorite things to talk about, my first book, baby. The
Mhm.
Three Mothers, how the mothers of MLK Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin shaped a nation. And it's about Alberta King, Berta Baldwin, and Louise Little, these incredible women who did everything that their sons later became famous for long before their sons were even a thought in their mind. And, when I say that, there's so many moms I can always feel who are like, obviously, duh, why does this still happen? This erasure of
Yeah.
our contributions, in our children's lives. And it's true. All of us are shaping our children in a variety of ways. And in these three cases, it is completely undeniable. They really did exactly what their sons went on to do. So Alberta King was the daughter of the leaders of Ebenezer Baptist Church. So she grows up believing that her faith is always intertwined with social justice, that she must use any privileges she has to fight for her community. She believes in the power of education. So she has a bachelor's degree, she has a teaching certificate. Something we cannot take for granted in the early 1900s for a Black woman. She marches, she leads boycotts, all of these things that we know MLK Jr. for. He's really just walking in the footsteps of the women in his family, of his mother in particular, and his grandmother. We also see then with Louise Little, Malcolm X's mother. She's this radical activist. She was born in Grenada. She is really inspired by her grandparents who were able to gain their freedom from slavery. And so they teach her that no matter what, you need to fight to live freely, that it would be better to die trying to live freely than to live oppressed, and that you
Mhm.
should never bow down to those who would call themselves your master. You should never bow down to the oppressors. You should fight by any means necessary. And so she joins the Marcus Garvey movement. She comes to first Montreal, then to the United States as this organizer for this international movement for Black lives. So then you see, okay, it makes a lot of sense why Malcolm X then knows all of this language and how these connections between the Marcus Garvey movement and the Nation of Islam are completely inextricable, honestly. And then thirdly, we have Bertus Baldwin, who was a writer and who believes in the power of language, the power of writing letters to people and helping them see that you can make it through the darkest of times if you can confront that pain and then focus on the light and focus on the love. And so she writes these powerful letters where even the principals at James Baldwin's schools say that they can tell that he's inherited his writing skills from his mother simply based off of the letters she would write to excuse his absences. So
Mhm.
this is these powerful, powerful women. So when people read The Three Mothers, there's always this sense of shock. Because the sons are so well studied, right? There's so many books about them, as there should be. I am never trying to erase the sons, but we actually celebrate the sons even more when we understand that they did not pop out of nowhere fully formed, that they did not come up with these ideas on their own, that they're actually carrying legacies that they themselves would have said, "Oh, my mom taught me that." So in reality, it's that so many scholars before me, mostly men, completely left that part of the story out. And they
Mm.
didn't care to tell us that part of the story. So when people ask me, how did it take until 2021 for your book to tell us this after the dozens of books that have been written? And I'd say, oh, patriarchy. Patriarchy. And but this confusion, like how and why and how did we lose record of them?
Mhm.
And then so I knew I was going to write something that helped us understand how this was just one symptom of many of this larger system that we find ourselves in. Like you and I have said, it's obvious to us. Like why is this
Right.
so, like why isn't this obvious to everybody else? And then as I was writing it, Roe v. Wade was overturned, as you mentioned, and again, I saw across the United States this shock from
Mhm.
so many people, frenzy of how did this happen in the United States? How? I think, of course this happened here.
Right.
What are we confused by? Why are we not paying enough attention? And then I realized, wow, American patriarchy has been so good those who maintain it have been so good at hiding it and making it seem natural so that we can't question it. And the other strategy has been to really highlight patriarchies in other places. Americans love to talk about patriarchies. It's like one of our favorite things to do. Oh, women, they are so oppressed over there. Wow. Wow. And that strategy, and I'm not minimizing the pain of patriarchies across the world. That is true. I'm also not in the business of ranking the patriarchies. I don't care about doing that. They're all bad. But we are distracted in the US because then
Yep.
we're told you should be so thankful. At least
Yep.
you're that woman over there. When mothers are dying in the United States, when they go into hospitals to give birth, when
Mm.
mothers experience extreme burnout here because we don't have community around us that honors our role. When, women and girls would see these horrific results of the Epstein files, and everyone again is just shocked.
Mhm.
This is normalized here, and we have been distracted by saying, "Oh, but just look over there for a little
Yeah.
bit." And really, just be grateful that you're not one of the women over there. When in reality, women across the world have been saying for centuries, you will not defeat us, you will not silence us. So this is a global movement against patriarchy, but we also need to make sure we are not tricked in our own nation.
Yes. Oh my gosh, there are so many of these tactics I see come up again and again, and you mentioned them. You talk about, "Oh, well, at least you don't live over there," or "At least it's not 200 years ago," or "At least it's not 50 years ago. At least it's better than it used to be." And it's always, like a shifting of the goalpost so that we're not talking about, well, how are we comparing these people who are living and breathing today right in front of us and what's accessible to them and who gets to be fully human and who doesn't right now? But instead, we're moving the metrics, right? And then we are, to your point, distracted by the actual conversation at hand. And I think erasure is another one of these tactics. And I always like to say, well, who does it serve? Who does it serve to change the goalposts? Who does it serve to erase this? And I think what you're saying is like, well, it serves the maintenance of the system in and of itself. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yes. And I would say too that the way we often speak about it in that terms of erasure is as if as a collective, like as if the United States as a collective, we have done better. So we should all be happy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's such a good point.
It's actually been there's 2 stories of the United States, and this is why
Mhm.
we can still be very proud to be American, so I'll explain the 2 sides of this, where it's like those who are so about the original social order and they love it so much and they've been holding on to it. That is one part of the story of American history. That is the part that we shouldn't be surprised by when it keeps responding, when it keeps trying to hold us back. That is one side of it. But what's more exciting and that we should be really proud of are those who said, it's not enough and we need to fight for more. And so the wins that we have experienced are theirs to claim and theirs alone. So when this other side says, well, at least we don't, at least you have that. It's this side says, oh, we're fighting for more. We're not done.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, we can celebrate how far we've come, but it's not this collective, all of us did this
Mm.
together.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about is the other thing that erasure winds up doing is it frames progress as this kind of like something the benevolent overlords have
Yeah,
enabled,
yeah.
right?
Oh,
Instead of the resistance.
yes. One of my favorite things to say is we didn't have these wins for this side by those who were in power waking up one day and suddenly saying, you know, I'm going to give people their rights today. Today's the day. I just feel so excited to include more people in humanity. No, at all. That's not the story of the United States. The story has been they did not want to give people their rights, and people demanded it and bled for it and did whatever they could to grab it and claim it. And so this is where we see contemporarily book bans, right? This is one of the strategies of erasure. making sure we take down the statues of those who have fought, painting over the words Black Lives Matter, because all of those are evidence of what it took for people to claim this. So this is the reason why, and it's what actually my next book is focusing on. We have so many people right now, and I'm not reducing the pain of this moment. There's a lot happening that we should be concerned about, concerned about. But there are so many people who are saying, this is the worst we've ever seen.
Mm.
This is horrible. I'm going to leave the United States. I don't know what to do. I've never seen, a neighbor pulled into a car. I've never seen. Really? Is this really the worst you've seen in American history? I really think maybe we should interview grandparents.
Mm,
Like, I don't, not, again, this is recent history, but
right.
it's where you're seeing the erasure being successful. Because if as a collective, all these people in the United States who were not part of the progress are like, oh, look how far we've come. And you should
Mhm.
be so grateful because look at the progress of the United States. Well, then we're also erasing the people who had to fight for us to get there. And that's what's the problem is when you say, I don't know how we got here. I don't know. This is the worst I've ever seen. It's actually that you're now completely unaware of how we got here. How we got,
And
yeah,
you're unaware of how we actually get out. So much of what my work is responding to is this myth of that if you make the system work for you and you do all the right things, you will magically unlock equitable access to power and opportunity.
right,
But a lot of what we're being told are the right things is really just reinforcing this status quo, right? It's not doing the work that we see actually made that historical progress because, right, we've erased it, right? We
exactly,
haven't told the stories of the Black mothers, right? And we don't understand that that's the resistance, that's
exactly,
the work. And
exactly.
I wonder, a lot of this is getting out of like the individualistic framing to collective framing. But how do you make that case other than telling people about the history of other than just the history of the United States of like, oh, the work that moves the needle, you want to know what to do now? How do you make that case of kind of collective action and resistance and what that should look like for people who want to feel like they can individually do something?
Yeah. So this is when we really do focus on the moments in American history where we've seen these strategies of oppression replicated, where we've seen how they're constantly recycled, where we really focus in on this tug of war that we're constantly a part of, whether you know it or not, you are part of a tug of war that's happening and we say, okay, how did this progress actually take place?
Mm,
How is it possible? And when we look at my first book, for example, if we look at the three women that I focus on, again, Alberta King, Burrs Baldwin, Louise Little, they were all born between 1897 and 1903. So think about the things that they've
mm,
witnessed in their lives. They experienced Jim Crow being the law of the land. They witnessed lynchings. They hear about lynchings constantly. They experienced two world wars in this nation. They experienced the Great Depression. They had their children during the Great Depression. In fact, they are a part of their own civil rights movement where they're using their own tactics for activism to try to shift these rules and to build something new, not operate within the system as it is designed, but to build something completely different. They inspire their sons to become part of the civil rights movement, the most famous one, arguably in world history. And their sons become leaders in this movement. So they live long enough to see access to the right to vote.
mm,
So we're from the early 1900s to then what they witness that they took part in. It's not just watching it, it's actively doing the work. of educating their sons, passing on their tactics of resistance, their sons carrying that torch and doing what they needed to do, and obviously all of the female contemporaries around them as well. And then, though, they live long enough, two of them, to see the first episodes of the Oprah Winfrey Show.
Mm.
They live long enough to hear about an Illinois state senator named Barack Obama. So, on one end of Bertis Baldwin's life, for example, she overlaps with Harriet Tubman. And on the other end of her life, she overlaps with me.
Mm.
So, when we trick ourselves into thinking or asking, what do I do when I'm in a scary moment? How, as an individual, can I have any power? You just need to look at these examples. They are out there. You cannot be fooled into this notion of helplessness and pessimism. That's a
Mm.
choice you're making because
Mm.
we have access to these stories. And if we don't have all the evidence, we can reconstruct them like I did for the three mothers. But we also we know that it wasn't. I mean, look, watch Seth's, like
Yeah.
what we didn't have to go through to get the right to vote in this nation. And and I don't want anyone to feel necessarily guilty, if they listen to this and they're like, yeah, why have I been sort of, in this moment of what do I do? All of that has been strategic.
Yeah.
There have been many strategies used so that you don't know where to start. But the reality is, you are aware. There's no way we get these wins without fighting for them. So we just have to study how people have fought. And I often speak about how there's sort of layers to our involvement and our activism. I think that first layer is a very individual one where we have to do work personally to understand how the system of the United States, this gendered hierarchy, this American patriarchy, has impacted the way we see ourselves.
Mm.
And whether it's that we're silencing ourselves or we think, I mean, there was the whole thing in New York Times about the women who want to give up their right to vote. And I mean, there's there's so much we can say about that. But there's obviously a personal thing happening where they're like, I'm supposed to be silent. I'm
Mhm.
supposed to not have a voice. So some internal work is really important. The second layer of it is in our relationships, in our households, in how we're parenting. Are we trying to replicate the original social order and tell our kids where they belong and have relationships of dominance or submission, et cetera, these binaries that come with American patriarchy? Or are we trying to create new and allow our children to help us do that? So that's the relationship side. And all of these things can happen simultaneously. They're not in like a step. But the third part is community, our community levels. Most of the change that you see throughout history happened first in a neighborhood, in a community where people say, we can see each other's humanity. We can respond to each other's needs. If we look at the rainbow coalitions, for example, there's so many of these incredible moments of activism where it was, if the country's not going to do this, we will do this for each other. And that's where the final part happens. That's where the nation responds, because that's when our elected leaders say, oh, this is what
Mm.
the people want. So we can't ever just stay in this moment of we don't know what to do. And we need our elected officials to do something.
Mhm.
Yeah, start right now, every single day, in everything that you do. You ask a question. Am I replicating a hierarchy or am I building something new?
I feel so affirmed because this was the hardest part for me in my process of writing my book. Because when I was sold this book, it was like, well, what's your solution? That was the thing every publisher wanted to know. And I said, well, this book is an analysis of understanding the problem because my argument was, if you don't really understand the problem or if you're misdiagnosing the problem, which is what my book argues,
Yeah.
then you can't come up with effective solutions. And so I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is similar in terms of like, oh, I'm trying to expose the myths, right? The myths that paper over the erasure and uphold the status quo.
Yeah.
But the thing that I came to when I pushed myself to say, okay, what's the next step once you do that is exactly what you said about the layers, right? I broke it down as interpersonal, institutional, and then cultural and political.
Yeah.
And very similarly, I have been really struck by understanding that this kind of resistance and pushback is something you can engage in on a daily basis, even in the context of your own home, right?
Absolutely.
And right before we started talking, I shared this reel that you made that you said, no shade, but many of you grew up in a mini patriarchy at home. That's why you don't notice how it oppresses you on a comment is blocking me here,
On a
on a
national
something level, on a national level. Oh
Yeah.
my God. I'm so obsessed with that because I I'm a fresh parent. You have 3 children, right?
Yes.
I have 1 daughter who's 2.5, so it's still new to me, and I will tell you that as much as I have been reporting about inequality for a decade, I
Mhm.
am blown away at how much, um, parenting really brings out very regressive gender ideals,
Oh, yeah.
not just in, like, an individual home, but, like, within the culture at large, and I live in New York City, so, like, it's one of the places, like, in the private sphere I've noticed there is a willingness to accept a level of, oppression and subjugation that I think most people would not tolerate
Mhm.
outside of it,
Yeah,
and, I think it's pretty fundamental to upholding these things that you're saying more broadly. You can't have this kind of male dominated system of power without having the free labor of someone doing all of that work in the home. So
absolutely.
I am curious, like, even with 3 mothers, you're talking about like mothering as something that is very political, right? And yet it gets reduced to this very individualized and personalized thing. And I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that actually is so much of what you said. I mean, it makes me think of how we think we're waiting for this moment for our whole nation to change, right? This
Mm,
system. But the reality is you can always live outside of it.
mhm,
And people have been always living
yeah.
outside of it. So it's not actually that we have to, like, there's always this notion of, like, we're waiting for the country to be ready, like, we're
Mhm,
waiting for everyone to be ready. That's actually not the transformative mindset that we need people to have. We need us to have, "That's made up, and we are living differently each
yeah.
and every day, and we have access to that." And if we look at how Black people, for instance, throughout American history have created their own communities and nations within this larger nation that didn't see us as human beings, we've had the Black church, and there's, many things we could say about any church, anything. But there's also these really beautiful moments of resistance that exist, and how the Black Panthers create their own ways where they're feeding children and they're bringing educators. They're, seeing each other's needs and helping with childcare when it's not yet available on a national level. All of these things are how we create that new world. And so that's the exact same, like you said, in our families. And it made me think of that because when I was writing The Three Mothers, I was also writing my doctoral dissertation on the same 3 women. And so I'm going much deeper into theory than I do in the book. But the research on the treatment of mothering in the United States, so many feminists, and mostly white feminists, had often said, women should just stop having children. Like, this is the thing that's keeping us stuck, is that we are playing the role they want us to play. So this was like kind of the representation earlier, and in terms of writing around mothering, that many white feminist scholars had. When I looked at how Black feminist scholars spoke about mothering, it was very different. It was more from this perspective of, they've tried to take our mothering from us. They've tried to rob us of this role. And therefore, we see our mothering every single time as the moment of a revolution, of building a new world, of ushering in new ways of doing things, of teaching our children to not be defined by this made up system by these myopic views, and instead to dream and find love and joy in a place that told us we weren't allowed to. And that is so radical and so inspiring. And that's what I want for all of us to see in the power of mothering. It does not
Mm.
have to be, I replicate this system. I don't have to live in the system. It's
Yeah.
made up. I can always make up something new. And that means, I think a lot of times folks feel like, okay, give me something that I can really grab onto. Like, what can I bring into my mothering? So, just an example, and we can also look to other countries for this. If we like to look to other countries and sometimes with judgment, there's so much we have to learn from other
Mm.
places. And I lived mostly abroad. I grew up mostly abroad. So, my dad is Ghanaian, my mom was French and Swedish. So they had a very kind of global perspective on everything, but especially on parenting. So in the US, we look at parenting and we're taught in a kind of a more mainstream culture that parenting should be the replication of the social order, actually. That we should teach kids how to be independent, that we should teach them how to soothe themselves, that we should tell them what the rules are so that they know how to follow them. This is how we think about it. We tell mothers what to feel. So if a woman says, "Hey, my body is feeling something," or "I'm aware something's going on," we don't listen to her because we don't really think that her opinion matters that much here, and we disregard it. We take control of processes that don't require control. This is why all this intervention that's unnecessary for the most part takes place. It's all about controlling the female body. And so when we see how those strategies are being used against us, that's when you stand up against it. So instead, you can say, hey, I actually see my medical providers as partners with me, not the authority in my life. So I will ask the questions I want to ask. I will seek guidance where I want to seek it. I will study how this was done maybe before men started to become so heavily involved in the
Mm.
process of birth. I will think about what my intuition is telling me. For example, for me, I always wanted to co-sleep with my kids. I'm not saying everybody has to do that, but that's just what felt right to me. So even though my doctor was saying, you should not do that, you're going to suffocate your kids. Because I'm a sociologist and I study these things, I knew that that was actually just somebody trying to tell me how to fit in the system. So instead, I said, actually, it doesn't feel right to me. I'm just going to go sleep with my kids. And I'm going to support other women and I'm going to be in community with them. And whatever decisions they make, I'm going to protect all of our right to have choice here. So that's an example. When you feel like you want to do something and you're hearing all these people who think they have authority over you telling you to do something differently, that's a moment to say, ooh, oh, I see the system operating. And now let me try something else that works better for me. So
Mhm.
every day in parenting, you're going to have opportunities like this where, okay, another final example, because I know we have to move on. If you have a little boy who says, I want to paint my nails, great,
Yeah.
awesome. There's no need to say anything. There's no need to say, oh, but that's just not really what boys do. That's not how it works. Instead, you can just say, amazing. I love it. Like every single day, try your best to not just pass on something harmful to them just because it's what we were told was normal. And instead, think about how we can continue to protect who they are and what they're bringing to the table.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like this imagining a new world, as you said, it's not like in some future that we'll arrive at and suddenly start living. It's something we practice every day, right?
Yeah.
And I think that isn't like a five-step checklist of send this resume and put this word here, but it is the way that meaningful progress is made.
Yes. 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 And that, there's certain things that I know in my mothering journey because I had the awareness of what I was up against,
Mhm.
but also I had advantages, right? I
Mhm.
had the means to be able to have doulas and midwives
Mhm.
who allowed for me to have the most amazing birthing experiences. I had a flexible career and schedule where I was at home with my kids, without having to give up something, in my career. And so when you have those moments too, where you have a little more access to hearing your intuition
Mm.
and protecting yourself against the system that's trying to control us, that's when we take it to the community level, right? And that's also when we take it to the national level, because everyone in this country should have had access to what I had access to. And
Yes.
we all should have access also to the knowledge of what we're up against. And so that's why my personal life is so intertwined with the work that I do and what I advocate for, because I know how impactful it was for my kids and for
Mm.
me, for my husband, and how we get to live in this different system because we have certain privileges that protect our time and our energy so we can make choices for our children that'll serve them. And so that's why we need to get to the point where that's happening on a national level. It's exciting that we're seeing it in New Mexico, childcare for all. Like these are moments that are possible. We can get there so long as more of us are willing to not only protect it for ourselves, but for everyone.
I say that, living in New York City has actually been a little bit more of a practice of hope for me in this time because we are seeing the expansion of childcare. My daughter is going to public, subsidized 3K in the fall. There's gonna be a twos program in the neighborhood next year, right? And it's just like the other revelation I had is like, well, we don't actually lack solutions. There's just a lack of political will and collective demand to implement these
Yeah.
things. And, that has been like, it shouldn't be that much of a revelation, but when I just had that moment, it was, and I think that's why reading your book and knowing this history and what we have overlooked or been taught to mythologize is so important, and I wanna thank you for writing it and for sharing it here. Um, Both Erased and The Three Mothers really appreciate your work and your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank
And
you.
where can we find you, outside of your books?
Yeah, everything is just my name, Anna Malaika Tubbs on Instagram and AnnaMalaikaTubbs.com. If you don't know how to spell it, you can look up Erased or The Three Brothers and you'll see my full name.
Perfect. Everybody go look it up. All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.